everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Francophile Reader. So today we are continuing our read-along of Notre-Dame de Paris by Victor Hugo, or The Hunchback of Notre-Dame. So today's section was Book 6, Chapter 5 through Book 8, Chapter 3. And I want to focus particularly on the intertextual references in this section, particularly on Rabelais. But first, let's talk about the beginning of our section. So the beginning of our section is Quasimodo's punishment. So if you recall, Quasimodo has been accused of insolence because he hasn't responded to the questions that has been posed to him, of course because he's deaf. And once the judge realizes that he's deaf, he actually just extends his punishment. So Quasimodo has definitely not been treated well, and Hugo is trying to shed light on the injustices of the justice system at this time period, which is the end of the 15th century. And actually our section is bookended by two trials. The first, of course, is Quasimodo's, and at the very end is La Esmeralda's trial. And La Esmeralda being, of course, our Egyptian bohemian character. She is accused of having killed this captain named Phoebus, who was in love with her, and we learn that, of course, it was Claude Frollo who murdered him because he saw that Phoebus was in love with La Esmeralda. But all the blame is placed on Esmeralda because nobody sees the priest, although he does have a reputation. They know that there is this monk who is causing problems in the town, but people aren't making the connections with Claude Frollo. So Esmeralda gets all of the blame, and so she is tortured along with her goat pet. And Djali has some tricks up his sleeve because he has been trained to spell out Phoebus's name, so that is seen as magic, and she is condemned of having employed magic to kill this captain. In both trials, we see how there are already preconceived notions that the judges and the procureur, the prosecutor of the king, have that influences the outcome of the trials. Quasimodo's trial is, of course, very reminiscent of Christ's. Quasimodo, he's placed on this turntable, and he is turned around, and then he is like whipped while he's being turned around. That's one of his punishments. And then his second punishment is that he has to be put in the pillory for an hour. That punishment was added after the fact, once the judge learned that he was deaf. After everything that Quasimodo has gone through, he's constantly asking for a drink. And that scene where he's asking for a drink is very reminiscent of Christ, who upon the cross asks for a drink. And of course, nobody's really giving him water. They give him water out of this broken vase, which recalls Gringoire's fake marriage to La Esmeralda, so that he can escape from being killed in the Cour des Miracles, the Court of Miracles. So all of these images are brought together in this one scene where Quasimodo asks to drink, and finally he receives something to drink from La Esmeralda, who's the only person who shows him compassion, and of course that makes him weep. And again, the weeping and the thirst all recall the Passion of Christ. But as I said, I want most of this video to be about the influence of Rabelais on this section. So Rabelais was an evangelical humanist and a satirist and a physician in the early 16th century. And he's most famous for two books. He actually wrote more books in the series, but these two books, Gargantua and Pantagruel, are the most famous. The first is Gargantua, which tells the story of this giant who is trained in humanistic teaching. And then his son is the protagonist of the sequel, Pantagruel. There's a lot of subtle and more overt references to Rabelais in this section, most notably in the scene when Jean Frollo visits his brother Claude in his cell to get some money from him, because Jean is perpetually broke since he is a troublemaker. And Jean witnesses the sort of the dark side of his brother, because Claude, as we've talked about, is very he's kind of this Faust-like figure. He has made a pact with Satan in a way, because he's obsessed with the occult. He's obsessed with knowledge for its own sake. He's not satisfied unless he knows everything. He's particularly interested in alchemy, and this is the reason that Hugo gives for Frollo's cold, hard personality. Jean, he's kind of hiding, and he witnesses everything that's going on. Of course, that foreshadows Claude Frollo, who is in hiding and witnesses what is going on between Phébus, the captain, and La Esmeralda. But anyway, so Jean Frollo, he visits his brother, and at a certain point, Hugo mentions how Claude is somewhat responsible for Jean's character, because Claude never really trained his brother well. You know, Claude was so preoccupied with knowledge for knowledge's sake that he really wasn't there to train his brother. And actually, his brother wasn't raised by him, he was raised by some other people, by a wet nurse. So that really reminded me of the story of Gargantua, who, like I said, is the father of Pantagruel. He's a giant. And when he is born, he, you know, the first so many years of his life, he's just kind of doing whatever he wants, until his father, Grangousier, actually hires this tutor named Ponocrate, and Ponocrate trains Gargantua in humanism. And the goal of humanism isn't pride, it isn't glory, it's, well, the glory of God. The goal is ultimately faith and charity in God. And that is actually something that Rabelais is trying to communicate through his very outrageous satires, is that humanism can be a vehicle for knowledge of God, and he has this evangelical humanist project. In contrast to Gargantua, who is trained in evangelical humanism, we see someone like Claude Frollo, who, while he is studying similar things, is very much driven by pride and personal glory. He wants to have knowledge of everything, but not so as to love God or his brother, but just so that he can be powerful and have all of this knowledge. In Pantagruel, which is the sequel to Gargantua, there is a scene in which there is this man named Panurge who encounters Pantagruel, and he is bruised and bloody, actually mostly charred, because the Turks, the Ottomans, okay, have evidently been roasting him on a spit, and Panurge somehow escaped, and now he is asking for something to drink. And instead of Pantagruel seeing that he is suffering and gives him something to drink, instead Pantagruel starts ridiculing Panurge, because he's constantly speaking these languages that Pantagruel either doesn't understand, or he thinks it's just so ridiculous that he'd rather make fun of Panurge's speech rather than actually help him. And so we see this abuse of knowledge, where instead of clearly seeing this guy is almost dead, instead of giving him the help he needs, he's just making fun of Panurge because he's not knowledgeable enough, or he doesn't speak well enough. And you know, there is this parallel here between Pantagruel and his arrogance, and then in Notre-Dame de Paris, Claude Frollo's knowledge, but his arrogance and his cold-heartedness in the face of his adopted son, Quasimodo. You know, he has all of this knowledge, but this knowledge is obviously not being used to, you know, further the kingdom of God. Ultimately, as a priest, that's the way it should be used, and that's not the way that Frollo uses his knowledge. And actually, his knowledge is presented as something that's extremely dangerous, because, again, kind of like this Faustian figure, he has made a pact with the devil. It's interesting that whereas Frollo is the priest and he is supposed to be the person who represents the faith, Esmeralda, who is in the eyes of the people in Paris, this, you know, demonic figure, this sorceress, she is the most Christian figure. She is the one who is there for Quasimodo, even though Quasimodo is deaf, even though he isn't, the most physically attractive. She is there for him, and so she's the most Christian. So I think that there are these several elements from Rabelais that really enhance our reading of Notre-Dame de Paris. What eventually happens in the story of Pantagruel is that he comes across a letter by his father, Gargantua, that tells Pantagruel that, he should be trained in humanistic learning so as to glorify God. And that's really, again, contradicted in the scene with Pantagruel and this friend of his, Panurge, who is suffering. Pantagruel has to, throughout the novel, learn what it really means to be a humanist, and what is that fine line between being a humanist in the service of God and being a humanist in that Faustian sense of just wanting to know things for the sake of knowing things. The court scenes are also very reminiscent of Pantagruel, because in the story of Pantagruel, the second book in the series, he presides over a trial between two men. One is called Imven and one's named Bezcul, which literally means kiss ass. And the two men are arguing, and they bring out all of their arguments. Their arguments are impenetrable, they're opaque, they use big words, lots of Latin, Greek thrown in. It's like the same sort of humor we see in Rabelais when he is making fun of the scholastics. It's just, knowledge for knowledge's sake, using big words but not really meaning anything. That kind of emperor's new clothes scenario where the two are fighting, but we don't even, as a reader, ever really know what the trial is about. And that's kind of like what we see here with these two trials. Everything that goes on is just ridiculous. Quasimodo doesn't get any kind of hearing. I mean, nobody ever really cares that Quasimodo doesn't understand what's going on. Or he doesn't hear what's going on. And Esmeralda doesn't ever get a chance to really defend herself. She's already considered guilty even before she takes the stand. Justice systems have, to varying degrees, been broken nearly everywhere. But there was this idea in the early modern period, late Middle Ages, that the justice system was really, really broken, and that judges were more interested in upholding the king and their own personal glory than in actually bringing justice to those who were oppressed. And we definitely see this in Notre-Dame de Paris. Esmeralda, unlike how she is presented at court, is actually someone who really values chastity. For example, she wears this amulet that is believed to protect her as long as, and to show her ultimately her parents, reunite her ultimately with her parents, as long as she remains chaste. And in the scene with Phébus, I felt very uncomfortable. First of all, I was very struck at how explicit that scene was. It made me uncomfortable too, because it doesn't feel always that Esmeralda has a lot of agency. She's just kind of snatched by Phébus. And then this priest who's lusting after Esmeralda and then kills the captain. It's just so sad to witness this. So yeah, it's a constant reversal, it's the reversal that we saw in book 1 with the King of Fools, and the carnivalesque nature of book 1 is a theme that runs through the rest of the novel. Everything is topsy-turvy. The priest is the greatest sinner. The person who is seen as the sorceress is the most Christian. The monster is the most sympathetic. And, everything is just reversed. And I think, again, that is a very Rabelaisian element, because Rabelais, being kind of the father of early modern Renaissance satire, does exactly that. Everything is reversed. So yeah, those are all the thoughts that I have. Some of them may be a bit disjointed, but as this is a book that is on my qualifying exams, which are at the end of August, I figured I would probably get some questions about the Rabelaisian aspect of this book, so I thought I would try to articulate that in this video. If you have been reading along with me, let me know what you think, and we will be finishing this book in a couple weeks. I have caught up, and I've really enjoyed this book so far. It's definitely a book I will be revisiting in the future because there are just so many references. Like I said, my edition has tons and tons of footnotes. I was hoping this would be a better lighting quality, but actually now I think there's just too much lighting, even though I'm sitting under a tree. Well, anyway, I don't know. I either have no lights or I have too much lighting. So hopefully some of this was interesting. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.